Would you look at that? Those clouds in the sky? I just got word that we are not having church Sunday. Can you believe it, boys and girls? I just heard that it is about to snow and we're going to have a story to tell. So why don't we start with a story, huh? Yes, let's have a Bible story today. Since we're not going to be in class because we're canceling our church services today because of the snow that may be coming. Maybe not, maybe it is. But regardless of that, we're going to have a special video here so that you don't miss this week's lesson. Just like we did a couple of weeks ago when we had our Christmas special. We just had a video for it because we were all meeting together in the sanctuary and we weren't meeting separately in the kids program. But whether you're a kid in kindergarten or all the way up to 5th grade, or whether you're even in middle school or even parents, maybe you can get something from this story today. We're going to be talking about a couple of Bible characters that were very important in the beginning of Israel's history. And we're going to be in the Old Testament. We're going to be in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 24 mostly. Now, I'll give you a little bit of background information before we get to chapter 24. So hang on, here goes the quick version. So you all know that Saul was the one that the people had chosen, that God had selected, and that the prophet Samuel had picked to be the very first king of Israel. Remember, there's a whole other story about that, about how Saul came to be king. But the more and more that Saul was king, the more he was kind of doing things that weren't exactly what God wanted him to do. So God said, you know what, Saul? You're not going to be the king anymore. There's going to be another king. In fact, a man named David is going to be the new king. And David was a great guy. He was the youngest of all these brothers, and you know all the story about David and Goliath and the giant. What, you haven't heard the story of David and Goliath? Come on, if you haven't heard that story, go read that a few chapters earlier in 1 Samuel. It's a great story. We get to meet David. So, fast forward. David is just a superstar. He's doing great things. In fact, he's winning a whole lot of battles. He's going out to war and he's leading some soldiers and he's winning a lot of victories. In fact, he's winning so many that King Saul is getting a little bit jealous of this guy David. This guy David is getting more popular than Saul, and Saul is actually the king. In fact, things got so bad that King Saul was kind of losing his mind a little bit. He started going a little bit mad, or a little bit crazy. He started doing things that just were not good at all. In fact, he grabbed a spear and threw a spear and almost pinned David to the wall. But David ducked out of the way and escaped at the last minute. And the crazy thing about all this is that King Saul's son, Jonathan, he and David were like best buddies. I mean, they were like BFFs. I mean, they were really good friends, even though King Saul was starting to get a little jealous of David. Okay, fast forward even more. David is on the run. He has had to leave and get out of the palace. He's had to run away, and he had about 400 men that were following with him. That's right, David had 400 men that were loyal to him. They were soldiers that were fighting under him, and they knew that King Saul wasn't doing the right stuff, so they were following David. So David and his 400 men, his mighty men, they had left, and they were having to live on the run. That means they couldn't settle down anywhere. Every time they went somewhere, King Saul would find out where they were, and King Saul would send an army and try to capture them and take them back. So David and his men had to get up and leave and go somewhere else. So this kept happening on, and David was running from one place to the next, and they were always being pursued and being hunted by King Saul. So you can imagine that David wasn't exactly pleased with this. In fact, David probably got a little bit angry as well. You know, David wasn't exactly a fan of being on the run all the time. Okay, here's where we get into chapter 24 of 1 Samuel. Now, this one time, King Saul and his army got really close to capturing David. They got really close to David, and they were about to find him. And just at the very last minute, here comes a messenger to King Saul saying, King Saul, it's important. The Philistines are attacking us at another location. So King Saul had to pack up his army, and they had to go fight the Philistine army, which was coming to attack Israel. So David got a break because King Saul and his army had to leave. Finally, when Saul finished fighting with the Philistines, he was able to go and pursue David again. And, you know, David and his men, they enjoyed being out of Saul's sights. They enjoyed being away from Saul for a while, but here comes Saul. He's catching up to them. And this time, Saul got a message. Somebody told on David, and somebody told King Saul where David was hiding. So King Saul got 3,000 of his soldiers to accompany him, and they went chasing after David. Now, meanwhile, David and his men, they had found these areas where there were some caves, so they could kind of have refuge. They could hide in some of these caves. David and his men, they went up into these caves, and one particular cave, it was kind of deep, so they were way back in the back of this cave. Well, Saul and his men were getting close to that cave, and Saul suddenly said, we need to take a time out. We need to take a break here. Really what it was is Saul had to do what we all have to do. You know, we all have to do something once or twice a day, you know, hopefully. He had to use the bathroom. What? That's right. There's a Bible story about one of the kings having to use the bathroom. Seriously. King Saul, he's the king. He's the mighty king. He's got on the fancy robe, and, you know, he's got his armor. He's still a good fighter. King Saul, he excused himself, and he saw this cave up here. He's like, that'd be a good place for me to go have some privacy, okay? So King Saul, he goes up into this cave, and in the back of the cave, you have David and all his men, and they're watching. And the men are coming up to David quietly, and they're saying, David, here is your chance. Surely God has delivered your enemy, King Saul, to you right here. Now's the time for you to go and take him out. But David, instead of taking advantage of this opportunity, instead of using that anger that he had before from being chased all the time by Saul, you know, David could have thought, hey, yeah, this is great. Let me take him out. Let me kill him, and then I can become king like God has promised. But instead, David did not act on that anger. David said, no, far be it from me to be the one to kill God's anointed one. Because, you know, King Saul still was the king. He still was the one that God had made be the king. So here's what David did instead. He quietly snuck up on King Saul while King Saul was, you know, doing what he was doing. And King Saul didn't know. And David got right up behind him very quietly, and he took out his knife, and he cut a little piece of the corner of King Saul's robe. He cut off a little bit of the cloth, and then he quietly went back into the cave with the rest of his men. Now you may be asking, that's a strange thing to do. Why would he go up that close to him, not kill him, but instead he used his knife and he cut off a piece of his cloak, of his robe? Well, here's what happened next. King Saul, you know, finished his business, and he left the cave, and he never knew that David and his men were there. That's amazing. God protected David and his men because King Saul nor any of his soldiers found David and his men. So King Saul leaves, and he's joining his men, and they're about to go and look somewhere else for David. And all of a sudden, David goes out of the cave, and he yells down to King Saul, here I am. Here is your servant. I am here. I am still your humble servant. In 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 10, David said, this day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lay my hand on my Lord, because he is the Lord's anointed. And look, here's proof. And he held up that piece of fabric, and King Saul knew that it was from his robe, and he realized that, oh my goodness, David was so close to me, he could have killed me. But David is a better man than I am, because David chose not to act on his anger and not to kill me. In fact, listen now to what King Saul said to David, verse 17 through 18. You are a better person than I am, he said. You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. You have just now told me about the good things you did to me. The Lord handed me over to you, but you didn't kill me. And King Saul's thinking, here I am in my anger, and I'm out here trying to kill David. And King Saul, I mean, he kind of broke down, and he cried. He was like, he and David actually kind of met up again together. And then Saul even fast forwarded a little bit in his story. He told David all about how he knew David would be a good king. And he asked David that when you become king, promise me that you won't harm my family. And David agreed to that. David agreed not to hurt Saul's family. Because remember, who was part of Saul's family? Jonathan. And David was like best buddies with Jonathan. But David made that promise, and that was a very significant thing. And David showed that he did not act on his anger, but instead he let Saul live and he obeyed God. And King Saul let David go on his way. King Saul took his men and left, and then David was left with his people, and they were there to go back to another place where they'd hidden before. Now, don't you think all this month we've been talking about self-control? And isn't this a great example of self-control? The bottom line for today's story is, don't be controlled by your anger. Wow. Think how David wasn't controlled by his anger. Think about how he spared King Saul's life, even though David had every right to be angry. So we can ask God to show us how to act that way as well. We need to ask God to show us how we can have the same self-control that David did. And finally, whether it's self-control or any other aspect of our lives, remember our Bible verse for this month. God's power has given us everything we need to lead a godly life. And we find that in 2 Peter chapter 1, the first part of verse 3. Well, I guess we'll find out soon enough if it snowed. It's starting to. You guys have a great day, have a great weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next week back at One Heart Church. Take care now.